Welcome to the Danish Institute for International Studies. Today for a seminar, an exciting seminar called The Dirty Side of the Green Transition, Extractive Industries in the Anthropocene. Before we kick off, just a small COVID-19 related message. We of course have very strict procedures to get in. Anybody who feels thus inclined, please keep to the groups you are coming in with and maybe keep a seat of distance between each other. Today we have a very exciting seminar for you with a series of experts on different aspects of extractive industries and the green transition. Let me just start out by introducing the speakers before I move to talking a bit more in depth about the topic of today's seminar. So first we have Alexander Dunlap from Oslo University. We have today with us Line Jakobsen from Roskilde University. Patrik Andersson from the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland. And Aalborg University is slated to be arriving in a couple of minutes. Then we have, we're very excited to have with us Tamara Gilbertson from the Indigenous Environmental Network and the University of Tennessee. And myself, I'm called Schouten actually, but well, fine. And I'm a senior researcher here at DIIS. What these people will be talking about after my introduction, what we're going to be doing today, is taking a deep dive into different aspects of the green transition. I'll try to frame the issue a little bit in terms of the big kind of dynamics that made us organize this seminar. And afterwards we have a presentation by Alexander Dunlap under the working title, Is the Green Transition a Myth? Scientific Evidence. Afterwards we'll move to Line and Tamara, and their presentation is called The Future is Extractive, Coal in Colombia and Beyond. And then Patrik, if he does arrive, will talk to us about China with his presentation called Green Giant, China's Approach to Transition Critical Minerals. After that we have time for a Q&A, and for those of you who are still alive by that time, we can also offer you a refreshment, a glass of wine or a beer to kind of recover from your journey through the dark side of the green transition. So in this brief introduction, I want to go over some of the recent kind of evidence to raise two main questions really. First, on a global scale, does the green transition reduce or outsource environmental and social costs? And second, does the green transition, again globally, entail a transition away from hydrocarbons, or does it complement a fuel addiction with increasing material intensity of our lifestyles? Faced with anthropogenic climate change, we are in a global race to reduce emissions and to try and curb global warming. To do so, we have to move away from fossil fuels. That's the consensus. This is exactly what the green transition is about. It is about, it's also called the energy transition, and it's about reducing hydrocarbon consumption by increasing the production of alternative renewable forms of energy, such as wind power, solar power, and water. Now, the green transition is truly mind-bogglingly huge, and it's already underway. It entails a vast global shift that will change the landscape around the world. Denmark is deeply involved. It is, for instance, planning, very much mediatized, to build the largest energy island in the world, hosting more than 200 wind turbines for a sum of amount of more than 210 billion krona, or 28 billion US dollars. But as this graph also shows, most discussions of the green transition are about technological solutions. Producing these technological solutions at the scale necessary itself has an impact that is increasingly worrying scientists. In particular, sophisticated clean technologies require very specific minerals and materials. Welcome, Patrik. Good to see you. And it requires not just a little bit of them, but it requires a lot of these minerals. This is the kind of overall bulk amount of extra metals and minerals required to be extracted and transformed into technology, into green technology, if we are to meet the climate goals. Overall, the green transition involves at least a 4-fold increase of mineral and metal extractions. In that sense, the green transition fits a pattern of increasing the bulk amount of nature that we transform into industrial materials, rather than reducing the material intensity of our lives. This is from a study from earlier this year, in which demonstrated that for the first time in 2020, the amount of human transformed and human-made materials physically outweighs natural material in weight, biomass. Now, common metals such as copper and nickel, but also lesser known materials such as cobalt, lithium, and rare earths are needed in huge quantities and cheaply for the green transition to be economically feasible. That's why these minerals are called transition critical minerals. Individual green technologies pack huge amounts of sophisticated components that rely on these critical minerals. Even seemingly common everyday technologies such as batteries for electronic vehicles and e-bikes and windmills are immensely material intensive. Here you see some examples, and the fine print might elude you if you're sitting in the back, but just to give you an impression of the kind of material elements that go into these different technologies. Where is all this stuff, this huge quantity of metals and materials, supposed to come from? If we look at some of these transition critical minerals, we see that they're sourced from countries like Chile for copper, nickel comes from Indonesia, cobalt mostly comes from the Democratic Republic of Congo, rare earths from China, and lithium mostly from Australia, but also from Chile and from China. So it's mostly a small set of countries located predominantly in the global south. Now, mining these materials is one thing, and we'll get back to that, but they're also really difficult to process and to transform into useful components. It requires a whole industrial setup. And below here, you can see where this process exactly is taking place. So some of the key metals and minerals required for the green transition, actually almost all of them, are processed and transformed into components in China. So China really has a bottleneck position in the production of green technologies. Obviously, the EU and the US, they look at this landscape with some concern in terms of supply risks. In fact, the 20th century geopolitics was in big part centered on trying to secure a steady supply of oil. From this perspective, the green transition introduces a new geopolitical landscape around the sites where control over these critical minerals and their processing can be turned into political power. The bottleneck, so said, of a post-carbon world. So, what is actually being done in these places where these minerals are being mined and transformed? In fact, what is happening is that the costs for the green transition, for the transition in wealthy countries to clean technologies, is being outsourced to countries in the global south. There's a huge impact of extracting huge amount of transition critical minerals. In very general terms, it doesn't look very good. Mineral extraction is a form of environmental devastation that's highly fuel intensive, but also water intensive, and it pollutes and destroys local ecosystems. Here's some of the basic impacts of green transition minerals. You can see under the header desert mines, how different kind of mineral extraction processes impact on the water availability in the local ecosystems where they are extracted. And you can see that for cobalt, there's a rather low impact on water. But lithium and copper, for instance, have huge water requirements, which are being sucked out of the groundwater in the places where they are produced. And then if you look at the air impact of air, you see a completely different profile. Cobalt here, the processing of cobalt is extremely pollutive in terms of the air quality around this process. Now, all these costs are born in the places and societies where these minerals are extracted and processed. But environmental costs aren't the only thing that's being outsourced to these countries. All these transition critical minerals have an overall very poor track record in terms of their local impact. Here disaggregated into a number of different kinds of impacts in a nature study published last week. And it concerns, again, possibly difficult to see in the back, into waste, water, conservation, communities, land use, social vulnerability, governance, environment, and social. These environmental and social risks are not equally distributed across the globe, but concentrated in the global south. Now, because of the concern for cheap supplies of these minerals, these local problems are increasingly becoming securitized as possible risks for the green transition itself. But this fear of disruption risks is in part false. Many of these critical minerals are common across the globe, but advanced economies cannot extract or will not extract them and transform them cost effectively, while also respecting their own environmental and social rules. Part of the problem of the green transition then reflects a more widespread problem, namely that advanced economies outsource a lot of the carbon-intensive and emission-intensive processes necessary for their own green technologies, but also other consumption goods, to other countries who are then responsible for these emissions, because carbon accounting is done per producing country and not based on where these emissions end up being consumed. This is again from another recent study in Nature, which tries to look at carbon accounting in supply chains for American and European products. And looking at non-transition critical supply chains, they show how countries in the global south are absorbing much of the emissions and producing much of the emissions for products which are actually consumed in other parts of the globe. And finally, I'll end here with a picture from recent fieldwork in DR Congo at a coltan mine. A lot of media reports and NGO studies reveal and denounce the poor working conditions and harsh life that is lived by informal miners that produce the raw materials for our technologies, from smartphones to batteries for electric vehicles. Of course, it's an affront to be confronted with this kind of suffering or rudimentary way of life. Now, these kind of revelation are often used to try and force companies to clean up their supply chain by stopping with sourcing from informal miners and instead source from industrial mines with higher labor standards instead. But in Congo, around 1 million artisanal miners are involved in this kind of work, and they support at least 5 times as much people, family or other people. The green transition and the impetus for us to have clean energy, also free from bad working conditions, may result in them being chased out of their livelihood with no alternative being available. So in this brief introduction, I've tried to raise some of the complex questions around the green transition and extractives that are emerging as wealthy countries accelerate their consumption of renewable energies. Now we'll leave the floor to the real experts, starting with Alexander Dunlap. Alex, the floor is yours.
This, yeah. All right. There's going to be some overlap. This is weird. I don't like this thing. But there's going to be some overlap, but we're also going to go a bit deeper. Good time, even it's a bit sad. So yeah. So this, I'll be giving you kind of a piece of what is kind of a 4-series lecture, and we'll be focusing on the raw material extraction issue, which was outlined very nicely, which we just saw. But we're going to go a bit deeper, and I'm going to press on you a little harder in terms of what this is. But Yeah, so I guess how my this is all squeaky. Okay, better? So a lot of this is I lived with different Zapotec and Akut groups who more or less lightly picked up their homemade shotguns and machetes and who were fighting wind turbines, and saw actually a lot of the problems of implementation of these kind of wind projects and things like this. And it's very nice being in Denmark, where this is where the Denmark model came from that was really promoting these things, and I think had a really great start. However, it's gone another way, but I guess to kind of the way one should think about, we should look at kind of the development of wind energy or any kind of low carbon infrastructure as the raw material extraction phase, the kind of land contracting in terms of how the land is kind of taken, then what are the social, economic, and ecological impacts for the operation of these, then what is the energy really used for, what is this being propelled, and then also, which we saw, decommissioning, which is another big and concerning issue. But unfortunately today, I will just be talking about the raw material and then try to give you a little more touch from those things. Okay, yeah, here's some fun stuff. But so kind of going back and pressing on the point that we just heard is, you know, what does green need? So yeah, the amount of concrete is ridiculous, you know, and it really depends on the geography of where you're trying to build these things. So there's going to be some kind of specific kind of differences. Also here from one of the European Union kind of breakdowns, there's more than 8, but here's roughly 8 different types of wind turbine generators that are going to have slightly different kind of material needs. But in the end, they're going to need a ton of copper, a ton of steel, and a lot of the different things that we talked about, and I can give you some more numbers about this. But here's roughly one wind turbine is going to need somewhere between a 7 and 14 meter deep foundation that's between 16 and 21 meters wide, which is going to be filled with concrete and reinforced steel. So this is rather significant, and this is particularly significant depending on the hydrology and the kind of the local ecosystem in the area, which means that also, so this is getting more into the operational phase, but if there aren't roads, then you need to build them, which means you're going to be cutting down animal habitat. That means you're going to be compacting soils, and if there are existing roads, then you will be, why are you raising your hand? Okay, thank you. I'm getting to this. But so you got to compact the soil, and even if there are roads, you're going to have to reinforce them. And as the person in the back got at, this is going to affect the hydrological table and all of the things like this, not to mention cutting. Can you please stop raising your hand? There will be time for question and answer. So you got to, and then this means underground wires. You're going to have to cut up and do a lot of different things to the environment. But then the amount of steel that you need between per megawatt, you need between 107 and 132 tons. And this also gets into carbon glass composites, which you need 8 tons per megawatt. And so this is rather toxic materials. Aluminum, I mean, it can go on. I'm going to just kind of read through these things, but you need between 500 and 1,600 tons per gigawatt. And so that means 3,500 tons of aluminum for 1 ton of gigawatt, or for 1 gigawatt. We can look closer at these. Copper, you need between 950 to 5,000 tons per gigawatt. And so the median is that roughly 5 tons per megawatt of copper. So it's rather ridiculous. And I've worked on copper mines in Peru that are particularly violent. Diosporium, one of the rare earth minerals. I mean, so there's one of the big debates is that you have some wind turbines that use rare earth minerals. You have some that don't. Actually, every single wind turbine is going to have some level of rare earth mineral in it. Sometimes it's just splicing the metals to strengthen some of the steels. They use them for the couplings to kind of hold them together. And then there's different types of generators. And so depending on whether you're having a direct drive turbine that has an average of 17 tons per gigawatt, or if you're using hybrid, only has 6 tons per gigawatt. But all wind turbines have rare earth minerals in them in some ways to strengthen other steels and things like this. And so cast iron is enormous. You have 30 tons per gigawatt. On the higher level, you can have 300 tons per gigawatt. Neodymium, similar, you know, for the direct drive, you have 180 tons per gigawatt, or in the hybrids, you only have 51. Parasodium, which I can't even pronounce properly, again, you have an enormous amount, and this goes on. These are just the kind of the more famous and well-known metals. There's even more than this, and we saw it in the last presentation, how much more there is. So, I'm not sure where the green is in all of this. But so, you know, it gets even worse. You know, I'm throwing different numbers at you in terms of what's going into this, but then to actually make and to produce all these things, there's going to be a certain amount of ore to waste ratio. So for example, for 1 ton of aluminum, you need 4 tons of bauxite ore. For copper, for 1 ton, you need 110 tons of waste ore, roughly. And this is coming from the London Mining Network. But this matches up in other approximations and estimates. For rare earth elements, and there's different types of rare earth elements, but there's 1 ton, you need 1.4 tons of radioactive waste, 6 million liters of waste gas with hydrochloric acid, and 200,000 liters of acid-containing sewage. And a lot of this, like for example in the EU, 97% of all rare earth minerals are coming from China. So a lot of this is exported, as we kind of already heard. Iron ore, 1 ton makes 3 tons of waste. Manganese, 1 ton is up to 2.5 tons of ore, so that means you're going to be mining much more. Zinc, 1 ton up to 33 tons of ore. Nickel, 1 ton up to 100 tons of ore. And coal for smelting, 770 kilograms for 1 ton of steel. So I mean, this is a lot of waste. This is a lot of mining. This is a lot of it's generating a lot of toxic waste. And as you know, with rare earth minerals, there's thorium, there's radioactive nuclides. It's rather severe and significant, but it's all on China's territory, so not so bad. Where does green come from? So, and yeah, it is bad, for the record. That was sarcastic if there was any confusion. But where does green come from? As we already saw, it's coming mostly from everywhere else in the world. However, as you all know or should know, the critical raw material frontier the EU has approved to begin kind of intensive mining is mostly hitting for the moment in Spain and Portugal, but there's kind of a green light to begin trying to mine and to internally colonize further countries in the European Union to begin closing this security gap, which even by their own estimates is going to take years and maybe isn't even really possible with these kind of efforts given the rates of growth and the levels of consumption that are going on. And so, I mean, we're going to get into it a bit more, but there's really nothing green about this. To call these things clean, green, is rather ridiculous. A lot of it's public relations that I'm not even sure where it came from. Maybe it just came from the 1970s after the oil crisis in terms of trying to come up with solutions to kind of salvage industrial lifestyles. But this is really distress. And a lot of my work has been really to kind of break down the fossil fuel versus so-called renewable energy dichotomy. So in public policy, in Norway right now it's big everywhere, where they're saying we will stop and hold accountable the fossil and hydrocarbon industries, but we will roll out tons of electric vehicles and an insane amount of wind turbines. But the thing is, and the metaphor I've been using to try to help conceptualize this, is that if you have an iceberg, you know, it looks like these two opposing positions, but as soon as you're going down the supply chains, you realize it's the same iceberg based on the same supply chains and highly dependent on hydrocarbons at every way, shape, or form in the process of a wind turbine or any other type of low-carbon infrastructure. You need the diesel for the mining trucks. I mean, not even to even account for this is insane, but you already apparently have the factories for smelting. You already have the mining equipment that got produced somehow, but then you still need to fuel those trucks with diesel to do the mining and things like this. Now there's this push for digital and trying to make those enormous big mining dump trucks electric and digitize the industry and call it green, which is very laughable, especially it's this crazy self-fulfilling cycle of more extractivism with the idea that if we can make everything electric, it will extract things slower and it can kind of self-propel itself, but I'm not seeing it. And here's a nice little graph that I did to just really show how everything, it's very rudimentary, but it's a graph to show how everything is intimately connected and is designed to constantly keep consuming and building more urbanization, more infrastructure, and I guess economic growth, since that's a lot of what's propelling this. And so here's some reductive supply chains. You can get an idea for specific minerals and how it works. But the point of this slide is to really stress that at every single level, you have fossil fuels or hydrocarbons. In the smelting process, the choke coal is extremely important to get these levels of heat to make the kind of the iron and the aluminum molds. So we have the examples of now Sweden is promoting green aluminum, and Norway for a long time has been using hydroelectric dams to do this, but they're still also using coal in these, though it's lesser amount. But there's some kind of deeper questions that need to be asked in terms of what this is all for, because it just keeps expanding. So yeah. So getting to the kind of transition, extractive scenarios, we already saw some of this already. There, you know, there's different scenarios to kind of reduce carbon and to look at these things. But overall, it's general consensus from the World Bank, even though I'm actually rather skeptical, I'll talk more about this in a moment, in terms of the science and the accounting in terms of what goes into all of these, and the numbers that I'm using as well I don't think are sufficient. But it's a fact that, you know, this confirms one of the critical conclusions of previous findings. Not only is low carbon energy transition materially intensive, but that intensity increases with the level of decarbonization. So the more decarbonization happens, the more mining that happens. And to be able to call this, to even call that decarbonization is rather crazy, and it assumes that the different kind of impacts and destruction happening in different mining sites aren't happening where we are. And so, for example, in Norway, they are not, one, there's big problems with carbon accounting that I'll talk about more, but even using carbon accounting, Norway is not accounting for anything past its borders. So that's how you can end up thinking that electric vehicles are green and making some kind of crazy assumptions like this. It's because they're not looking into the supply chains. And so while, for example, in the city of Oslo, you are going to reduce emissions, you are going to have cleaner air, air is getting dirtier somewhere else in the world. And the thing is, we live in a world that is a closed ecosystem. And so like we know with Fukushima disasters and other nuclear problems, when these things happen, these pollutions and problems tend to circulate across the globe. So while you might be cleaning things up under the rug in one place, you're actually accelerating ecological destruction in another part of the globe, which is still in your ecosystem or your planetary ecosystem. But getting more to these kind of boring statistics, which I don't think, I just want to stress in terms of talking about these numbers, this in no way, if anything, it's hiding the amount of political violence and a lot of the crazy issues that go on with this. But just to go through the numbers, we already heard some of it before, but according to the World Bank, and again, this is based on 2018 levels. This isn't 1990 levels, this isn't whatever levels, this is 2018 levels, which are already rather high. But aluminum, indium, and silver is slated to go up 300% by 2050. Copper, iron, lead, neodymium, and zinc, more than 200%. But if you look close, but a lot of this is based on 2017 data. A lot of the data is missing. But the European Commission has a bit more data, which is even more alarming. So just EU wind and solar infrastructure demand for lithium, diosporium, cobalt, neodymium, and nickel is supposed to go up 600% from 2018 levels in 2030 and go up 1,500% in 2050 based on some of the projections. The EU, again, so looking at the demand for electric vehicles, lithium is supposed to go up 1,800%, cobalt by 500% by 2050, and again by 6,000% for lithium and 1,500% for cobalt by 2050. And the other one was 2030 before that. Guess what, though? I had to review and go over all these things. I was one of the contributors on the Green Mining is a Myth for the European Environmental Bureau and Friends of the Earth Europe, but this isn't even accounting for, this does not include accounts of, the need, this doesn't account the amount of energy and different kind of, for even leaching and extracting these metals. So usually there's low rates between 3 to 10% of 1 ton of ore for rare earth and specialty metals. So this isn't even accounted for. This does not include e-bikes, scooters, and distributional infrastructure. So distributional infrastructure are power lines, transformers, and things like this. So none of this is even in the accounting. So for all these different wind parks or solar, whatever you want to call them, they all need power lines, they all need transformers, and so that this is another huge and enormous cost and supply chain that's not accounted for in these numbers. This also, but hey, congratulations, Copenhagen, for banning the e-scooters. I appreciate this. Oslo is flooded with them, and it's crazy how people don't want to walk and ride their bike, and they want to have these machines and these different magnets to do these things for them. And it's really nice to not see the scooters littered everywhere. But yeah, let's go smart, digital, smart cities. Guess what? All those centers that include everything in the periodical table are not accounted for in these numbers still. Also, unexpected increases in demand aren't accounted for as well. So Norway's demand of electric vehicles has already surpassed previous calculations and estimations. So this isn't accounted for. This also includes ore grade. The more of this you mine, the more that the ore grade goes down and the deeper you have to go. Some people try to counter this by saying improvements in technology, but overall, while this debate goes on, it's still not really changing kind of the structure of the issue. So yeah, real nice. A lot of the accounting, I mean, and this raises another, we'll just go to the next slide. But this raises so many issues in terms of like, where did these numbers come from? What is this data? How was this kind of measured? What models were it put into? And once you start looking at life cycle assessments and all the econometrics and arithmetic that goes into this gymnastics, it's rather disconcerting, especially if you're an anthropologist who works in mining areas and has to witness obscene political violence and all of the different things that are done to kind of secure these mines. So there are real epistemological issues that aren't being discussed in terms of, you know, prioritizing and giving a special status to quantitative data in terms of understanding these things, which are hiding so much. And some of the things that they're hiding, and so it's the means of reduction, but this is hiding landscape degradation and destruction, so that there are serious qualitative problems in terms of what these numbers are signifying or masking in terms of the types of ecological destruction taking place, especially with tailing dams, which are, they break almost as much as oil pipelines leak. Water use, we heard about this, there's an insane amount of water use that's being used. Ecosystem toxification, you know, rivers, soil, air, humans, you know, in terms of actually how to measure this, the impacts it has, the types of cancers, how that actually relates to other problems, existing problems there in terms of diet, in terms of the health things. It's super difficult to kind of pin these things down, but it's known to be rather significant and underestimated. Also, people don't want to give up their water. They don't want to give up their livelihoods in a lot of ways, and this usually requires the application of, you know, the scientific, as Walter Rodden used to say, the institutions of scientific violence, but really the application of counterinsurgency, which means, you know, brutal riot police, mercenaries, and different things like this to fight, divide, but also soft corporate corporate responsibility programs that are more or less applying kind of carrot and stick strategies to kind of break these things, which are rather brutal. Again, on top of this, there's always a nice thick layer of racism going into these things, especially whatever country I'm using from the kind of the urban centers, trying to go to these rural areas to apply these things, which are rather abhorrent. And I mean, the list goes on. But these are things that we need to kind of think about when we're looking at these numbers, that there's so much being concealed by these data points, and it's also questionable where these data points came from, how they're being used and plugged into models. And a lot of this is, you know, it's public information that you're buying through different kind of private sector databases that you're plugging these things into different models. I'm not going to use names, but there's anyone who looks at this stuff knows that where this stuff comes from. So, woo, how much time do I got? But I'll just keep going. But this is kind of maybe moving away from the raw material side of things and really saying and stressing the point that there's no such thing as energy transition. There's been one transition from from sustainable resource use to mass consumption and permanent and constant growth. If we want to talk about energy transition, there is, yes, it's true, there's a socio-technical energy transition taking place in terms of different formations of technologies and arrangements in terms of shifting things around. But even that is very questionable when you look at these graphs that show that there is just a constant growing and addition of low carbon infrastructures to existing mixes of gas, solar, coal, you name it, hydrological. And it's not looking very good, and consumption is growing, economic growth is, the train is going unreflectively despite everyone talking about climate change. So this leads up to another issue that I'm kind of just throwing in here into this presentation is, you know, there's the claim that wind and solar is infinite. We can just keep extracting this. And so there's the problem that low carbon infrastructures are kind of new frontiers of enclosure and privatization, but they're also of extraction. You know, wind isn't just infinite. You know, these are part of important cyclical cycles that work around the earth that kind of that move. So when you're putting a bunch of wind parks in one place, you're actually extracting kinetic energy, and it's actually creating big problems down the way, which we'll get into a bit. But so there's the concept of green extractivism that, to my knowledge, I really started to popularize with my friend Andrea Brock in 2017. But there's a couple ways we can look at this. You know, there's the extractivism for so-called green technology and initiatives. And so this includes, you know, there might be conservation militarization. So the way that conservation is being sold as green, but it's still using AR-15s, trucks, and all these different things that are supposed to be green and helpful, but they're deploying helicopters to shoot subsistence poachers and so on and so forth. That's another can of worms. But, and as I said, it's enclosing and privatizing and extracting kinetic energy and or value from ecosystems in the planet. And so this is to really stress that wind and solar is not infinite. There is the extraction of wind and solar and hydrological energy, and this has consequences. And so this, with wind, this brings up the concept of velocity deficit. So when you have wind going, and this gets with the higher quantity of wind turbines and the larger the wind parks, and especially where they're placed, this means that they're actually capturing the velocity of the wind and dissipating it. And this is, yeah. And so this is ultimately disrupting vital flows and different paths. And so one of the questions is, you know, what is the socio-ecological, even genetic product of domesticating lifeways? You know, what are the consequences of preventing the from solar energy from going into the ground? What happens when we're constantly extracting wind and solar or even other hydrological or tidal resources? There's more answers in terms of talking about wind. For example, you know, wind extraction causes you know, not only through models, but also empirically, it's causing weather modifications with possibility of causing climate change. It's been well documented between 18 to 23 kilometers downstream effects in terms of actually altering the weather patterns. So this means that there's significant warming trends up to just there's a different variation, but one on the lower end, there's 0.75 Celsius per decade. And this is compared against wind and non-wind areas in these regions, as well as, you know, when you put these things in there, there's, in the kind of the wet seasons, there's unprecedented flooding, a lot to do with the hydrological issues of building these foundations, among other things. But then there's also extreme drying in different seasons. There's day-night, hot-cold extremes. It alters the biological productivity. So like a lot of interventions, so there's a lot of research done on roads. You know, roads are splicing and fragmenting habitat, but you can find there is some benefits, and there's different adaptations from different species to try to use these things. Sometimes it works, sometimes they're just getting hit by cars more, but the same thing's happening with these different kind of weather and climate fluctuations. But overall, it's rather concerning. But again, there's long-term impacts. There's long-term impacts that aren't known, and that, especially from a kind of a materialist philosophy or ideology, is really neglecting and assuming and seeing the world as a resource instead of actually looking at the seriousness of how important different vital flows are, like the wind, for example. And yeah, just to touch on before this kind of goes to the conclusion is, yeah, the decommissioning of these things is rather concerning. You know, for example, a 3.1 megawatt wind turbine creates between 772 and 1,807 tons of landfill waste, up to 440 to 85 tons of waste sent for incinerator, and 7.3 tons of e-waste. And so this is ridiculous. And you know, the rates of recycling are rather low. Lithium is -1%. I just realized that was the thing I was trying to remember a week ago to add into here, but the recycling rates are ridiculous. Obviously, there's efforts to up recycling, but this is very little. Yeah, and so with the kind of the EU projects installing up to 100,000 new wind turbines by 2050, it's estimated that there's going to be 730,000 tons of e-waste will be generated. So this is crazy. But just to kind of wrap this up and kind of express some of my main concerns, you know, I'm calling for kind of an insurrection in energy research to really change the way that we're approaching and understanding these things. And so the first part is really stressing the need to begin unpacking supply webs and to understand what they are and how they really exist. And this is tied with the life cycle assessments are not good enough. The arithmetic and the way that this is being done really needs to be unpacked and critically assessed at every corner. And so this kind of means like really asking, you know, how is this data how is this quantitative data being collected? How is it being quantified? You know, and even just asking what constitutes data, and the modeling itself needs to be radically deconstructed and confronted and held accountable. Because, and the sad thing about this is sometimes a lot of the modeling researchers are rather explicit of the assumptions they're making and really how detached and abstract these things are. But somehow by the time it makes it to the front page of the newspaper about how so-called renewable energy is so great, that's not really even what the authors said in these things. But the point is, and to be clear, I think that low carbon infrastructures are important, and they're definitely the pathway to go. But it's, I mean, this goes to the fourth point, so I'll wait on that. But as researchers, and I think as everyone, we have to change the language that we're using to talk about these things so we can actually be honest. And if we're honest about the language, we can actually then see the problem that sits in front of us that needs to be fixed and solved. Because at this point, we're kind of walking around lying to ourselves, being like, it's renewable, it's sustainable, it's clean, it's this and that, it's energy transition. But from where I stand and kind of what I'm showing you here is none of this is true. And it sounds like we're just lying to ourselves so we can prolong and continue this existing habit of consumption, production, and lifestyles that in many ways are very luxurious, but at the same time, if we start looking at school shootings in some countries, but also suicide rates, use of pharmaceuticals, I'm also not convinced by how happy people are in these lifestyles here. But the fourth point, a lot of what we're talking about, all of this is pointless until we actually roll back industrial production and consumption. So this means that the importance of a lot of the degrowth literature that's coming out, and also the post-growth literature, and how any conversation about energy transition really is pointless until we are actively decreasing production and consumption. And so this means really questioning the, maximizing corporate shareholder value and profit maximization imperatives at every company and every corporation. This is a structural and legally binding problem that is encouraging more energy use and more material use, which makes any conversation about so-called renewable energy or transition really, really difficult. And I'm not seeing it, is what I'm saying. And then really this is more specific to energy research, but there's a lot of kind of fetishizing and romanticizing of energy democracy. And obviously I think this is an important avenue that needs to be developed. There's been a lot of I think one should actually approach these issues, and this isn't to advocate energy dictatorship. To the contrary, this is to really stress looking more critically at actually ways to organize, to use less energy, and to really look at different modes of organization that will be less energy and material intensive, and also more supportive and increase the well-being of people's lives. But with that, I think I'm out of time. Thank you for hearing me out, and hopefully some of these numbers and these concerns will be useful and worth considering. Yeah.
It's working. Thank you, Alex. Wow. Okay, after this presentation, we will move to a different side of the globe and a different kind of extractive frontier. Tamara and Lina, you will enlighten us on coal in Colombia. The stage is yours.
It's not on. Is it? Do you hear me? Yeah? Okay. It's not as high as Sanders. So hello everybody, and thanks for having me here and having us here. I'm happy to do this talk with my good friend Tamara. So yeah, we are going to speak a bit about coal in Colombia, but basically our title is The Future is Extractive. So it's a little bit continuing some of the points that was just made by Sander, but turning to the focus of the traditional extractives, and in this case, mostly coal. So yes, while there is a growing attention to the extractive nature of these critical minerals for the so-called green transition, we really should not forget that fossil fuels are still a big part of our energy consumption. And coal also is still largely being extracted and burned on a global scale. So we believe that we can actually learn from the traditional extractives, looking at some of these fossil fuels in order to understand some of the and the nature of this so-called green transition. Can I use this? Is this just sorry. Yeah, okay. So today we're going to speak about yeah, first we'll present ourselves, then the state of coal historically and also today amidst the climate change in the 21st century, and the importance of coal that is still existing. Then briefly, really like reminding ourselves of some of the social and environmental impacts of coal mining and also the combustion of it on a local and a global scale, and that's where we are going to draw a little bit from our research on in Colombia, but we are really also talking on a more global scale here. And then Tamara is going to speak about some of the contemporary strategies that are being used by investors and companies and states to really justify a continued extraction of coal, despite all the known impacts of coal. And she's going to run you through three selected strategies, not saying that there is not more, but one is the compensation CSR tool, and the other one is offsetting and carbon markets, and the third one is this new idea about, well, maybe it's not so new, but emerging narrative about, yes, in the future we'll be able to do the capture of this of the carbon. Yeah, and the final remarks in the end. Yes, I am Line. I did my PhD a year ago, soon to pursue a postdoc at Roskilde University. I have a long experience in Latin America doing activist and academic world work. And I studied particularly the coal mining complex in Colombia, focusing on the security practices of the companies and how they try to protect their investments into coal. And Tamara, do you want to present yourself?
Can you hear me? Is it on? I thought I hit the button. Hitting the button, yeah. I'm Tamara Gilbertson. I did my PhD at the University of Tennessee. I am currently a lecturer at the University of Tennessee. I also work as the Climate Change and Forest Policy Advisor for the Indigenous Environmental Network in the United States, or on Turtle Island, as it is called. And I'm very happy to be here, so thank you very much.
And Tamara and me, we met in Colombia when we did our fieldwork for our PhD. So we traveled in rural areas, looking at some of the affected mining communities in the northern Colombia. Yeah. Coal it can be many things, and it also is extracted in different ways depending on the materiality of it. I think I don't want to go into this because we have so much on our mind that we don't want to run out of time. I want to say that coal historically is a really important mineral and fuel. It really fueled the Industrial Revolution, and it experienced a massive escalation during this period. And the economic shift to a more colonialized capitalism in the 18th and 19th century really also kickstarted this, and of course the improved technology to not only extract but also transport coal helped this escalation. I got some numbers here that says that from 17 to 1850 the production of coal increased by nearly 500%. And I want to find the mouse, but I can't because I want to scroll down, which is a little bit strange. Maybe you could find it for me? It's a little bit weird that I can't find it. Do you know how to find it? It's kind of disappeared. I just want to scroll down here. It's weird. Well, anyways, it's not so important. It would be nice. Okay, I might miss a few points because yeah, I wrote something here. Then yes, coal. One of the reasons why it became so popular is because it was easy to transport compared to oil and gas, for example, and easy to stockpile. So the whole infrastructure was a bit more easy to go than other fuels and minerals. Yes, and UK, US, Germany and France was traditionally, historically, some of the important coal-producing nations. And for a long time we've known that the extraction and burning of coal have different impacts. Today we know that it's the world's dirtiest source of energy. It's really like the one with the highest amount of CO2 emissions, and it is a major contribution to the climate catastrophe. It causes deforestation in many areas where the mines are. It converses a lot of land, it pollutes the air, it pollutes the water and the soil. And for a long time we also know that especially the miners inside, they suffer from black lung. and other respiratory illnesses. And that's something that we saw very much in Colombia as well, that the local communities living around the mines, even though this was a very modern industrial mine where they really had standards for these things, people suffered from all types of respiratory illnesses. So we want to raise the note that this is really also not only about emissions, it's also an environmental justice issue. It's about local communities, and we know from research that indigenous peoples and people with color and people with low income, they are particularly impacted by these things. Coal mining in Colombia is a good, I would say it's a good example to look at some of the global trends of coal mining, because not only does it reflect the history of coal mining and the shifting market, that before it was very much exported to the EU and Western nations, and now it's going east, I would say, and the market is shifting. It's really not declining, it's shifting. The majority, like almost 99% of coal extracted in Colombia is exported. So nothing is really consumed in Colombia. And also the whole challenge and issue with local communities, with displacements, and the local environmental impacts are really like representative for global coal mining. So looking at Colombia is kind of like a good reflection of these things. Yes, what we saw in Colombia was that the coal mines, they caused like a lot of displacements of communities. Few of them were resettled, but they are also like used in the PR material that we do resettlements here. It's really like they're using that, but a lot of other communities were just evicted or displaced. Rivers are drying out because of the mining, or deviated, so that it's artificial rivers. Yes, a lot of things can be said about this, but I actually want to speak a bit more about some of the global the state of coal today in the 21st century amidst climate change. Because yes, it is true that if you look at the consumption, it is falling, but it's not in a decline. And there's some evidence saying that it could even go up again. We see that the price of coal peaked in around 2008, and consumption peaked in 2013. And of course, I mean, then we have seen going down a little bit because of the global awareness about the need to really phase out coal. We all know that that's kind of like the consensus. Well, maybe not climate change deniers, but the rest of us would say that yes, we would need to close down some mines and stop this, but it is not in decline as we see it. Well, I could put many numbers in here. I didn't. I also didn't put a lot of theory in here because I wanted to really represent some of the research done on this. A few years, was it 2019, it says coal represented almost 40% of the global power mix. And the growth in coal's contribution to the global total primary energy supply was more than twice that of renewable energy sources combined between 1990 and 2015. So it has been going slow with the phasing out of coal, and today we have major coal producers still. Today it's China, the US, and India are really like the largest ones. And as I said, geographies of coal are moving east. Now it's not so much the European nations, but the India, China, Australia, Indonesia, Russia, and Turkey is also a good big consumer. So while big investors might divest from coal, and at least they are saying that they are going to do it, we also see that new coal mines are opening up in many places around the world, and not only in Africa, but also in Australia, and even in UK they're discussing opening up new mines. So yeah, we really have to be critical when people say that coal is about to decline or finish. We also saw during our stay in Colombia that coal mines were receiving new licenses to either expand or open up new pits in the mining areas. So it's in the global south that it's taking place now. This is just like the graph of the price, and of course you can see that it had a peak and then it fell and then it booms and busts, and it's been falling now. But what we just see now, actually after COP26, is that the price is rising again. And we have this idea that that is because investors kind of got a green light to say, okay, it's not so dangerous to invest in coal because it's not going away. There's still markets. So investors are now entering into the market again and wanting to invest in this. So let's see if we're going to even see a new tiny or maybe big boom in this. We'll see. But anyways, many of you might ask, how come? I mean, how can this continue now that we know that it's really a bad thing for the climate and it's bad for local communities, and there's a lot of really negative things about coal, and now we have the green renewables and all that, so we should just do it. But they have many ways of justifying and normalizing a continuation of this, which is what Tamara is going to speak about now. So, thank you. Yeah, I don't know, I didn't use it, but I mean.
So, I'm just gonna hold this, I think it's better like this. Can you hear me okay? Yeah? Okay. So, coal is one of the dirtiest fossil fuels, and we know that, and it's been around for a really long time. So how is it possible, having all of this data that Lena just laid out for us, how is it possible that coal continues to be extracted and burned in the 21st century? How is that happening? Well, there are several different ways that big transnational coal companies justify their existence. And I'm going to, really, is it that low? I can feel like a rock star. So how is it happening? Why is it happening? And one of the main things I want to start with is understanding that coal corporations, and especially the multinational corporations, the big ones like Glencore, they use legal strategies, but that's not new, okay? Legal strategies by multinational corporations is something that's been used for a very long time. They lobby, they sue states, they do all kinds of things to make sure that their contracts for extraction are viable and that they stay viable for long periods of time. But I'm not going to talk about the legal strategies. I'm going to talk about three other things that I feel like are not talked about enough, and they're also things that we're going to see a lot more of in the decades to come. So the first one is on compensation, and I'm going to explain a little bit about what that means. The second one is about offsetting and carbon markets. And the third one, I'm going to talk about carbon capture. And carbon capture takes us into this sort of techno-fix space that Xander was talking about earlier as well, and like this very big focus on how we can sort of techno-fix our way out of the problems of extractivism and the problems of climate change and some of the other violent socio-environmental conflicts. But starting with compensation, what we mean by that is something that's used by corporations to basically silence and quell resistance, right? So if there is pushback from local communities, this is a way that they can use this as a tool to sort of keep that, those pesky resistors at bay. One of the things that we have seen quite a lot of in the field was these projects. So this picture over here is a fish project. The company Prodeco, which is a subsidiary of Glencore and the region of Cesar, set up a little pescicola proyecto to basically do to make fish in fish barrels. Pretty much, they looked like something that you'd swim in the summertime in your backyard. And for about a year and a half, I drove by this road looking at this project that was never set up. And I asked people about it, like, so in those tanks, is there anything in there? And they would laugh at me, and they would say no. And anyway, we think they're just setting them up to boil the fish because they're underneath the hot sun. There's no way they can grow fish in there. There's no protection. So this is one thing. They promise projects like this for labor. They call this a food security project. There were never any fish. There were never going to be any fish. And even if they were, this was not a viable or even wanted project by the community. But it looks really nice on paper when the corporation can say that they've created a food security project for the local community, and it's fantastic. But the real issue on the ground and the reality of what's being done in the space is why it's so important that we listen to communities' voices, and also that we do the research on the ground, right? And that we actually look at what's going. We must dig deeper. We must do better to understand that projects like these that compensate for the justification of direct and indirect and cultural violences that are done on the ground justify the extractivism that we see today. Second one is money, right? This is also an old strategy. If you give a leader of an indigenous community or a leader of another community a bit of money, or you do this in a way that does not uphold the rights of free, prior, and informed consent, for example, that divides communities. So what we're seeing when I talk about money to communities is not just about handouts to quiet people, but the money represents something else. It represents a way to divide communities, and this is old colonialist strategy, right? Divide and conquer. And it also represents something else, that for some communities that choose to live in voluntary isolation or choose to live outside of a capitalist economic system, giving money to communities is a way to bring communities into that system, which represents a process of exploitation and co-optation over time. I'm going to speak longer than that because Lena and I got a lot less time. So land as well. Land is another thing that we've seen given to communities, right? How do you give a community land when the land is already theirs? Right, so if we think about this from a decolonizing perspective, how do you give indigenous Wayuu people land when the land is already theirs? Or they see it, they have a different cosmovision, right? But also there's a very deep connection to space and place. And so big transnational corporations coming in doing their so-called development programs, then giving land to communities. Sometimes we've seen a few examples where corporations give land for quite far away to farm when those lands are not viable for the types of farming that the communities that we were working with would even want or would even be able to get to. They didn't have transport for it. But on paper, it looks great. Resettlement, Lena already touched on this. I won't go into it. Many communities are just evicted in violent ways through, armed groups backed by the state. There's a lot of violence, and I've written quite a lot about that. And then, of course, future promises will give you something in the future, or we're creating jobs, or we're creating labor, or we're going to create this for you. And again, these are various types of compensation projects, and they live within the framework of corporate social responsibility. And there's quite a lot of critique coming out on CSR, as there should be. And in Colombia, this is something that's actually written into the laws that the corporations have to follow. But they follow them using these strategies. The next one I want to talk about is carbon offsetting and carbon markets, or carbon pricing. This is something that's been around for a long time. We can trace it back to the 1980s in the United States. But of course, through the Kyoto Protocol that was signed in '97, the markets came online in 2005. So the biggest carbon offset markets in the world is called the Clean Development Mechanism, and that was set up within the Kyoto Protocol just in countries in the Global South to sell credits to countries in the Global North who, through their emissions trading systems or cap-and-trade systems, ETSs and cap-and-trade are the same thing, to basically be able to buy their way out of actually having to reduce emissions at source. So emissions don't have to be reduced, credits can be bought, and the system continues. Now with the Paris Agreement and Article 6 being passed in Glasgow a few weeks ago, The Clean Development Mechanism is now what is called Article 6.4, and it will be called the Sustainable Development Mechanism, or the SDM. And the SDM will be a way for countries to, again, sell credits through the system. So one of the things that we see as well with carbon offsetting and now carbon pricing systems that has the ETS systems, the cap and trade systems in it, but the carbon pricing systems also include carbon tax systems and RED, or reducing emissions from deforestation and forest degradation programs that's run by the World Bank and the UN. But Colombia, for this example with coal mining, uses a carbon tax system that is underneath a carbon pricing umbrella. And the coal mining industries that Xander pointed out, that even whether it's extraction at the coal mining sites or extraction at other mineral sites, they don't have to comply to paying the carbon tax on those machines if they invest into a project. And those projects can include things like RED programs or biodiversity offsets, payments for environmental services, and basically buy credits. So we're also seeing a huge expansion of carbon banking and biodiversity banking, where corporations can go online, and we'll probably see this as well with a lot of the minerals that have been spoken about earlier. They can go online, they can say, okay, I want to buy this many credits and offset the impacts of the biodiversity at this mining site for lithium, and then we will just offset that. And boom, Bob's your uncle. It's done. Click of a mouse. Super easy. Great, right? Not great, no. And I've also looked at the other side of where the sort of biodiversity offset programs and projects are taking place, where they're planting the trees or where they're restoring a wetland. And it's not what you think it is. In fact, I've seen huge resistances of communities that have burned down the trees and said, this is bullshit. This does not help us. These are not what we want. In fact, this is overtaking our lands. And these are not trees that we can do anything with. And in fact, this is encroaching on our land. So it's incredibly important that we look at this through a critical perspective of what this actually means, because in the end of the day, this justifies more extraction. I can talk a lot about carbon offsetting and pricing, because that's actually what I've dedicated like the last 20 years of my life to, but I'm gonna skip that because I need to move on, because I'm about to get kicked off stage, even though we only got 20 minutes to share. And I'm gonna move on. Oh, I need to cough. Sorry. I want to make us aware of a couple things. Language like carbon neutral and meeting net zero emissions targets is more greenwash. Carbon neutral basically means buying offsets with a click of a mouse. It means net zero emissions targets means basically buying more offsets with a click of a mouse, either through so-called nature-based solutions, which is offsets for land, ocean, forests, or the other side to meet net zero emissions targets is carbon capture. Carbon capture is coming online really fast. It's not exactly new. 90% of it is enhanced oil recovery, which is basic, and this is old technology. It's taking CO2 or carbon dioxide, compressing it for the purposes of putting it inside of oil and gas wells to take out more oil and gas. Okay, it's used as something for extraction. 90% of it in the world is used for EOR. The other bits are for like direct air capture, which is a fantasy. There's only a few of those places in the world, and it's, again, this is a techno fix. Carbon capture in the latest bipartisan infrastructure package in the US has been given over $10 billion, with all of the EV and all of the green technology build out. We're looking at over $100 billion in the US that's just for the harmful things that are being talked about today. Carbon capture we're very worried about because it's not just for the carbon capture hubs that are being built and expanded, it's also for the carbon pipelines. So you can't see this very well, but this is the upper Midwest. This is a carbon capture pipeline structure that's being built right now. A lot of this is private funded, public money that's being converted into private funds again. So this comes from public money to then help big fossil fuel corporations build out these green carbon capture infrastructures. This is over further into Ohio, and they're using things like the DAPL right-of-way. So maybe some of you heard about Standing Rock a few years ago. Well, those were really big pipeline fights, right? And some of those were won, some of them were not. But the same pipeline right-of-ways that are used for these struggles with indigenous peoples are being used for CO2 pipelines. And these pipelines are huge. They're bigger than the oil and gas pipelines. And they have to be reinforced with special steels and special minerals, okay? And they leak as well. In Louisiana, just a few months ago, there was a pipeline leak. And people were walking around, had no idea why they were sick. They were foaming at the mouth. And they didn't know why. It was like a zombie apocalypse. They went to start their cars to get to the clinic and the hospitals, and the cars wouldn't start because there was no oxygen in the freaking air, okay? So now we're looking at a massive build-out. This is Louisiana area. This is in New Mexico, and it's also being used to retrofit coal-fired power plants and say that they're green, and it's green coal, it's renewable coal, and it can stay online as long as we capture the carbon. Only in the carbon capture systems, only about 20% of the CO2 is actually captured, but they tell you that it's all being captured. And that's very well researched, and I have a lot of data on that. So in conclusion, it's not only is coal still extracted and burned, but coal is also being framed as part of a green solution, okay? Through carbon capture programs, through the carbon markets, and a whole host of other ways. And it's also something to look at that's really important, because the fossil fuel industries are using the same types of strategies as will a lot of the mineral extractives as well across the board. And finally, I just want to say that, and I think that Xander was touching on this, I think maybe we would say it in different ways, but if we don't have a social environmental justice framework to energy in the 21st century, renewable energy extraction will replicate the same extractive and developmental power imbalances and violences inherent in the global capitalist system. And we need to look at as well and address some of the scale issues with this. So I'll just leave these references up, and thank you, Pierre, for letting me go on a little bit longer.
Thanks a lot to Lina and to Tamara for that. It's an amazing presentation. So now we're going to take a slightly different tack on an angle on this whole question. We have Patrik, who joined us a bit late, but we're very happy that he's here, because he's going to take a perspective that's a bit different, looking at China and considerations of what critical minerals are in China. Now, this is a really important question, because China is, as we've seen in the first presentation, it's a lot of data backwards today, but China is one of the key countries producing some of the transition critical minerals that are out there right now, being used across the world. And China is also one of the biggest processors of transition critical minerals in the world, and therefore being watched with concern by Western nations because of its potential to disrupt the green transition and transition critical supply chains. Patrik, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me now? Well, the microphone works? Or is the volume okay? Okay, great. Yep. So I will talk about China's approach to critical minerals, with a focus on how Chinese researchers and policymakers understand criticality and assess criticality. And at the end, I will discuss and speculate a bit around what this might mean for the green transition in China and elsewhere. But first, some words about my background. So I'm doing a PhD at the Geological Survey of Denmark and Greenland, GEUS, and Aalborg University. And my PhD project is about Chinese interest in Arctic minerals. In particular, how sort of a combination of geopolitical interests and priorities and China's demand for different minerals, how they influence investment decisions of Chinese companies. So although I'm doing my PhD at GEUS, that's where I'm being employed doing my PhD, but I'm not a geologist or a resource economist or anything like that. So my background is in China studies, and I think it's good to be clear about that when I'm talking about these things. China is often at the center of discussions around transition critical minerals, because in the West we rely on China for supply of many of these minerals. For rare earths, for example, which are used to make permanent magnets that go into wind turbines and electric vehicle motors, China dominates the supply chain, from mining and processing to making the advanced products that the high-tech industry can use. And of course, China has paid a great environmental cost for achieving this dominance. Mining and separation of rare earths can be an extremely polluting process. But in the last decade, the Chinese government has made efforts to clean up the industry. They have cracked down on illegal rare earth mining, which was very widespread. They have also created a quota system for the production of rare earths, to which only 6 selected companies, all 6 large state-owned enterprises, all 6 of them are large SOEs, they have access to that quota system. And this has had the effect of encouraging some Chinese companies to bypass the quota system by mining and processing rare earths outside of China. It could be a way of moving some of the pollution of rare earth mining overseas, while still making sure that China gets the rare earth resources that it needs. Whether this was by design or not, I don't know, but the quota system can have this effect, I believe. So anyways, these policies all follow from the recognition in China that rare earths is a strategic resource for China's development. In fact, rare earths are among a group of minerals that are officially labeled as strategic in China. And that brings me to an important point, which is that what is critical or strategic, what is a critical or strategic mineral, and what it means to be strategic, that varies between countries. And that's because the label critical also has the supply risk dimension. A material that is considered essential for making, let's say, an electric car battery or a wind turbine would usually not be considered critical if there is also not supply risk. And also differences in industrial development priorities will also influence what is critical in different countries. However, while my focus is on how China understands criticality and on Chinese domestic policies, what China defines as critical and the policies it makes to support and protect the critical will have a big impact on the supply of transition critical minerals also in the rest of the world. And that's because, as we have talked about already, that and I mentioned also, that China is the main supplier of many raw materials that are considered critical for the green transition in Western countries, including for rare earths. So China's official labeling of rare earths as a strategic resource, which should be regulated and protected, thus has a global impact. But now I'm getting ahead of myself a little bit. So what I'm going to share with you today is basically a summary of one of my thesis papers in which I studied Chinese assessments of mineral criticality. And I found that we know very little in the West about how Chinese researchers and policymakers assess the economic and political importance of minerals. What labels and categories do they use? Do they call them critical or strategic or something else? And what do these different lists look like? And does this labeling and categorization have any impact on policy and, by extension, on Chinese industry. So the common way of looking at it would be that industrial needs and supply influence raw material assessments, which of course they do also. But what if, especially in a country like China, where the state planning of the mineral sector is still significant, what if raw material assessments in turn feed into economic planning and lead to policies that industry must follow? So I think it seemed reasonable to assume that in China, official criticality assessments would have a larger impact on policy and planning than in more market-based systems. But we know very little about how this actually plays out in China. So what were my findings then? Well, I found that Chinese discussions around criticality are focused on a concept of strategic minerals. That is the preferred label in Chinese raw material assessments, and it has a distinct meaning in the Chinese context, which I will soon explain more about. And the experts that engage in Chinese debates on strategic minerals, they are mainly geologists, resource economists, and mineral resource strategists. And they debate questions such as, what are China's strategic minerals and why are they strategic? How can they be categorized? And also, what should China do about them? So that's basically policy suggestions. So what are China's strategic minerals? Well, in short, from the Chinese perspective, the strategic minerals, they fulfill different needs in China's industrial development. And they are therefore divided into different subcategories. And I will focus on three important ones here. So you have what they call the strategic staple minerals. I know staple mineral is not a term that's used in the West usually, but I struggled with how to translate it. But they are minerals essentially that China needs in very large quantities for construction and manufacturing, like iron ore, copper, aluminium. And then you also have the strategic emerging industry minerals. That's what SEI stands for. And they are minerals needed for developing China's emerging high-tech industries, like, for example, rare earths, lithium, and graphite. I think it's the minerals in this category that most closely resemble the critical or the transition critical minerals that we're talking about today. The Chinese government has a list of strategic high-tech industries, which includes, for example, electric vehicles, biotechnology, and next-generation information technology. And then you have the advantageous strategic minerals, which overlap with the SEI minerals. And the most frequently listed examples of these are rare earths and tungsten. And to me, this is the most interesting category because they are strategic not because of supply risk, but because of the exact opposite. So these are minerals for which China has significant market power and influence. So we see that unlike in criticality assessments in, for example, the EU or the US, where there has to be a supply risk for a mineral to be critical, both economic importance and supply risk. The Chinese concept of strategic minerals is broader in the sense that it also includes minerals for which China dominates or has a dominant role in the supply chains. In fact, they are strategic for that very reason. So I don't want to exaggerate the difference between criticality assessments in China and elsewhere. I think the core of criticality assessments is the same everywhere, and that is a fear of supply disruption of important minerals. But it does suggest a wider scope in the Chinese assessments than we see in, for example, Europe and the US, all of which are countries with advanced manufacturing industries that rely heavily on imported raw materials. And an interesting finding from my paper was that in Chinese planning documents, we see that different policy measures are targeting different categories of minerals. So in 2016, China published its first list of 24 strategic minerals. And it announced many policies for strategic minerals, as well as policies targeting different subcategories of strategic minerals. And we see, for example, that the minerals belonging to the category of advantageous strategic minerals are the most heavily regulated. Their mining is the most protected, and they are the only ones subject to production quotas in China's 5-year plan for mineral resources. And the plan also lists several policy measures that explicitly target the strategic emerging industry minerals. I think the strategic staple minerals are probably the least regulated, although coal may be an exception. Of course, there are a lot of reforms targeting coal to reduce industry fragmentation and try to make it a cleaner, Chinese coal cleaner, yeah. And I think the fact that the plan refers to these categories when discussing these policies suggests that categorization actually means something. That that being included or excluded in a mineral category, it actually matters if there are policies that explicitly target those categories of minerals. So to wrap up, what does all this mean for the green transition in China and elsewhere? Well, first, I think countries that rely on China for supply of transition critical minerals like rare earths, it's good to pay more attention to domestic processes in China for deciding which minerals are strategic or critical, and therefore should be prioritized in the Chinese state system, especially since these assessments feed into Chinese mineral strategies and policies. And if I can speculate a bit, I think classifying rare earths as a strategic and advantageous resource that must be protected was necessary for cleaning up the industry in China, although this classification existed before. So I guess there also has to be political determination. I think, as is often the case in China, you need to have a combination of these two. But if this means that China sources rare earths from countries with lower environmental standards, I mean, if that's one of the effects of the quota system, then it wouldn't necessarily be good for the green transition. So it would only mean that the pollution is exported elsewhere. So yeah, thank you. That's what I had.
All right, Patrik, amazing. Thank you so much. Guys, you survived a pretty long sit. This was a lot of different angles, a lot of information. Not all of the most happy kinds of information about the green transition, the role of extractives, the continued role of extractives, one should say, in the 21st century, despite the calamitous situation when it comes to rising temperatures and so forth. So before we can offer you a glass of wine or a beer, there must be people who have questions. There was already one guy who raised his finger twice during the presentation, so maybe we can take a round now. Maybe we collect a few questions. Is it okay if the speakers come up here so we can just collectively kind of try to address any questions that may emerge? I have a hand over there. Yes, sir. There will be a microphone with you in just a second.
Thank you very much. Very good presentation.
Please introduce yourself.
My name is Jakob. I'm educated from Roskilde University. Yeah. Okay, so you were very critical about for example, the exploitation of minerals in Congo and Africa. So these countries, they don't have many opportunities, economically speaking. So what would you suggest come instead of mineral extraction in like a country of Congo or Indonesia or Colombia and such countries? Because if they have an advantage, if they have an opportunity to advance the economy, they would just use it, right?
Very good question. We have one question. Do we have more questions that we can address in the first round? Yes.
Thank you everyone for really good presentations. My name is Lisbeth and I'm a freelance journalist. I've been writing about lithium extraction in Portugal, or rather the pursuit of lithium extraction, because it's very early days still with the European lithium market. But I'm very curious and puzzled about the China case, because I think in all the research I've done, I've seen the same numbers again and again and again, with China being the bottleneck, not only for production, but also for conversion of minerals. So looking at China, this is for Patrik. I was curious whether he has discovered whether this this road to becoming the bottleneck was driven by China's own strategic interests, or whether it was fueled by, say, China's knowing that they could actually be a bottleneck for the entire world. Because when we talk about China, I think it's rather recent that we see China being so ambitious in terms of green transition, but still they occupy this bottleneck position when we talk about transition critical minerals. So was it driven because they saw the rest of the world is going to need these minerals and we can actually take a leading position, or was it more from an internal need for these minerals?
Great, we have 2 questions already. I want one more question. Don't be afraid, don't ask, oh wow, okay, not all together. I think she was first, yes.
Well, just to follow up on Africa, transparency and accountability in fossil fuels, it's been a big problem for many, many years. We have no country-to-country information, and we have no possibility to see actually how the countries can benefit from the revenues that come out of fossil fuels and coal. So how do you see the possibility for transparency and accountability when we talk about green minerals? Can we start anew? Can we claim more transparency, more accountability, both from the multinational and from the governments, or will we end in the same situation where natural resources don't benefit people from developing countries at all, but benefit a small elite?
Great question. You forgot to introduce yourself.
I'm Connie from Dupont from Oxfam EBIS, and I worked with Extractives in Oxfam.
Great. Let's collect a few more in the first round. We have a hand over there. I think it was early, and a hand over there. I'm not sure which one was first. Sorry.
Hi, my name's Ev. I am a mason, the stone, not the free kind. I was wondering about when it comes to issues of carbon accounting and the language used by academics, like what's going on there? Is it a lack of intellectual honesty? Is it a lack of bravery? Is it some sort of deeper cultural liberalism sort of thing that influences how people think? Why aren't researchers being like stringent and going to the depth which these issues require? That's it. I might have another question later, but I'll try and be respectful to other hands in the room.
Yeah, is it okay to take 1 or 2 more and then do a round? Is that okay for you guys? Yeah?
Hello, my name is Stefan and I work for Novo Nordisk within sustainability, identifying and implementing initiatives. My question is for you, Alexander. I think that was your name, right? Yes. It seems that you're addressing the establishment of, turbines and solar cells and that kind of thing. Do we not gain anything back when in operation? So over the 20 years or however many years the item is in operation, do we not gain a little of it back, or is it so minute that even from that perspective it's not worth it?
Great question. I think we can get you on the list there. Yeah.
Hi, yeah, my name is David. I'm a student in the climate change program at Copenhagen University. And I had a question. We kind of, a lot of you guys compared the current ways of extractivism of the renewable metal industry, like a lot of these rare earths, to current like fossil fuel extraction. And I had a question about, we know that like for a lot of the fossil fuels, there's a lot of monopoly in the industry where a few huge companies control a lot of the production and everything like that. And I was wondering, out of curiosity, what was the situation for mining today? Is it like similar, where very few huge mining companies control a lot of the supply, or like, yeah, what's the landscape corporate-wise for a lot of the mining today?
Great, I think we have a good setup of questions there. Should we follow the order of speakers? Maybe to give a round of feedback? Feel free to address any question you feel that you have anything to say to. Yeah, maybe. What should we do, guys? Now I'm more insecure.
I think you should begin to speak to the topology of the last question.
Okay, yeah. That's a really, really great question. So oil to extract has specific material kind of requirements, which make it very much amenable to large scale and concentration, right? Even though in the United States you will see a lot of micro oil companies which are just maybe have one or two pumps doing the mining. I think the same goes for extractives. There's also a market in which there's a lot of very big companies, like Glencore was mentioned, Rio Tinto, for instance, and there's a number of these very big companies which operate in different kinds of metal sectors and dominate some of them. Some of which are state-owned in the case of China, and others aren't, but definitely all subject to strategic considerations by home states as well as subsidies. But there's just as much and maybe even more in the mining sector, informal, artisanal mining, as well as something called semi-industrial mining. So artisanal miners, they really work with hand tools, so to speak, and I think there's a way in which semi-industrial mining will involve like pumps to pump out water out of mining pits and a bit more advanced tools, but it's still small kinds of companies. So there's a big frontier of informal and artisanal mining around the world, especially in the global south, where it's not regulated so much. And it depends on the country how important that is, right, in terms of production and in terms of livelihoods, right? But it's not to say that informal mining is much better for the environment. It's often really bad as well, and so the effects that it has locally might not be as beneficial for the environment, even if it has a much bigger kind of social justice component in some cases, and not others. I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. So I think the DRC question was more for you, but I would say that it's rather important to begin developing kind of post-development kind of alternatives to the existing extractive regimes. And so this means kind of appreciation of local development and culture, and ultimately resurgence of kind of cultural practices to really begin creating subjective well-being, creating harmony with ecosystems and things like this. So rather ideal things, but I think really ultimately it's a decolonial project of actually kind of having these knowledges resurge and to really try to create situations to cultivate and to support those things the best people can. But I'm not really one to speak anything about the DRC. So carbon accounting, good question. And I realized in the presentation I didn't really get into it. I have a similar question to you, actually. I have no idea. There's actually a great paper by Antti Silvast up in, I think, northern part of Norway, where they actually looked at the psychology of modelers and how they actually can do and justify these things. The paper did not go as far as I wanted it to in any way, shape, or form, but I was so happy to see this kind of collective article really getting at to how modelers can justify what they do. And yeah, for me, it's a huge problem. I mean, even carbon accounting, you know, the World Resource Institute and the business sustainability ultimately in 2001 created carbon accounting and the standard to use carbon accounting. And carbon accounting is used as the main metrics for, I believe it's 6 different, like methane and different kind of gases. So the thing for me and my problem with carbon accounting is that it's rather reductionary, and it can be used as approximations for some things, but the problem of ecological catastrophe and climate catastrophe can't be reduced to carbon. It's far more complex, and it's ultimately I see carbon accounting as well as the framework of climate change. Obviously climate change is happening. Obviously it's probably 4 times worse than what anyone's kind of saying or talking about, or at least that's my opinion. But at the same time, with all the awareness that climate change has made, I feel that and same with carbon accounting, with all the awareness and all the talk and all the chatter, somehow things are proceeding as normal. It's actually stripping agency away from people to remember that climate change is local ecological disaster, and to remind people that the fight against climate change is in these buildings in terms of how they're designed, in terms of how we live, inside the universities, inside these places. So I want to stress our agency and that our abilities to actually stop these things where we are. And with frameworks like climate change, as much as it's true, it's often putting the power in the hands of international representatives, NGOs, or different kind of corporations to kind of address this large-scale issue that no one can address on their own. And it's a huge problem, and I think everyone has to get kind of serious about this. So climate change, as well as carbon accounting, I feel are disembodying kind of frameworks to more or less measure as the world burns and not actually be serious about this. And I was in the European Parliament last week and was very clear that there's not a single policy, in my opinion, that is being serious about climate and ecological catastrophe. So I have similar concerns. The levels of abstraction and on abstraction that are being used to kind of justify and to go in circles about these things, I am against. So are we gaining anything from wind energy development? I mean, the question is like, what is gain and who is we? Is kind of, unfortunately, I throw the questions kind of back, but to try to at least get to what I think you're going. Every political conversation or any conversation about power comes down to your relationship to society, industrial structures, computers, and things like this. And so if for example, you're a big video game enthusiast and really love technology and just can't get enough of the different feeds and the clicks from our emails, and I mean, technophilia ultimately.
Like you.
Yeah, I mean, you should see me with my email clicks and my Twitter now. It's embarrassing. But I want to be self-critical about my technophilia, and also the way that technophilia, which is well documented to work with kind of workaholism, and there's probably not a more toxic kind of work front than academia or any type of corporate job. But I think there are a lot of important possibilities with low carbon infrastructures. I think that I am an advocate of taking back our power and doing more decentralized, more small scale to know and to be able to come closer to the levels of production, consumption, and use in general. But like I said in the presentation, until the corporate maximization, until maximum profit, maximum growth, until that's addressed, the whole conversation and the talk about renewable and transition is a huge myth and a public relations campaign, as far as I'm concerned. So until that there's some very structural economic and social issues addressed, we're just kind of running our wheels, and then there's something to it. It's not all bad, but it's in terms of really addressing ecocide, ecological and climate catastrophe, it's all very questionable, and it's very much on this train of kind of development in this way that it doesn't have to be this way, and I think there's so many great alternatives that can be exercised and developed, but that's a whole nother conversation. But hopefully, yes, I see that there could be some gains, but it's very hard for me to see that given the trajectory of how the economy and the state is organized. And I think I'm done.
All right.
Yep. Can you hear me? Good. So I think the question was about how China achieved the bottleneck position in the supply chain, whether it's a result of Chinese strategic planning or something else, right? Yep. So I think there is this famous quote by Deng Xiaoping, the former Chinese leader, from 1992, or at least it's attributed to him, when he said that, and this was at a time when the US was still the leading producer of rare earths. And he said that the Middle East has oil, China has rare earths. So there is this perception, at least, of China as taking a very strategic approach to minerals. And of course, China also has all kinds of 5-year plans still, not just a big overall 5-year plan for the economy. They also have all kinds of 5-year plans for different sectors and even for different commodities. So there. So I think basically it's a combination of long-term planning and having the resources, of course, first of all, the reserves, long-term planning and making the investments needed, and then also other countries not being willing maybe to pay the environmental cost of some of these of the mining and the processing. So, yeah.
Maybe just to add to that, is it correct that I've read that the US actually actively approached China to start up the rare earth sector there because they really wanted to outsource, right, the production because of its environmental impacts to kind of outsource it to China, and that kind of became a model for other kind of mineral producing industries as well. It's like, okay, well, this can be done cheaper, and we can outsource the environmental damage, right, for Western consuming countries of these products.
Yeah,
as well.
I can address a few of the other questions, I think. Maybe not completely, but at least I want to say a few things. The first thing was your question about transparency and whether, or at least the way I interpret your question is whether we are going to see some of the same challenges with transparency, broadly understood, I would say, from the old type of mining or the old extractives like coal and other fossil fuels into the new renewable energy sources. I mean, there's been a lot of initiatives to try and really improve transparency. And when I say transparency, to me, it's about all sorts of things. It's about how companies are paying taxes and revenues to states. It's about the emissions they are causing. It's about consultations with local communities. It can be a lot of different things. And there's been a lot of challenges with that in the fossil fuels industry, and initiatives have tried to really improve that with the IT, the Extractive Industries Transparency Index. And what I see, at least from my research on Latin American cases, is that we see some of the same challenges with the new, with wind parks and hydro and all the other big projects, that it's so difficult to find out what is really going on. The wind park that is being built right now next to the mines that we've been studying in Colombia, local communities, NGOs, they don't know much about what is really going on. It's also difficult to find out how the companies approach the whole, like all their legal commitments to paying taxes, the consultations. So I believe that we are going to see some of the same challenges. And that leads me to the point about the extractive nature of this. It's not only because it's extracting something from the ground or taking something, it's also the whole, you know, the power dimension of this. It's about power. It's about it's like we call it a coal complex or an oil complex. It's part of a bigger network of elites, of businesses, of different types of international institutions. Even some NGOs are taking place, and that's why it's not only like if you want to think about or imagine a possible solution to that, I would say it's not only about lowering consumption or degrowth. It's also about attacking some of the power holders in this whole network. So that's yeah, as Sander says, it's the same bottom of the iceberg, so to speak, that we're dealing with here. Yeah, and I do believe that that's a little bit the same with the corporate. You are asked to the corporate landscape if there is the same big mining companies, or we're seeing a new landscape here. I haven't researched this, so I shouldn't talk much about this, but what I see is that it's entering into some of the same dynamics about and some of the same big mining industries. They might divest from some of the heavy fossil fuels, but then they are continuing doing more or less the same with renewables. That's at least how I see it. Yeah, I think that's what I want.
I think we covered all of them. I think we're good. Yeah.
Sure.
I mean, there's a report that came out. I was interviewed for it about 2 or 3 weeks ago or a month ago, but there is as much or near as much human rights violations in low carbon infrastructure projects as there are in fossil fuel industry projects. And again, I don't necessarily agree with some of the data in terms of how it's done with kind of quantitative work, but at the same time, based on all my personal experiences in terms of my own personal case studies or reviewing case studies in the literature, it adds up. But so it's established.
Okay, so we're approaching the end of the session. I know you're tired, and this was really tough, but don't hesitate. This is a nice chance to ask some questions to some people. Don't be afraid to ask provocative questions. Say, I totally disagree, or you guys are being too negative. Anything, now's a chance. You still have 5 minutes, so please go for it. Yeah. Just 1 second, you get a mic.
Hello, my name's Louisa. I'm a student at the University of Copenhagen, studying climate change as well. And my question is to Lina and Tamara. You talked a bit about the necessity of having a social and environmental justice framework to guide the energy transition that we're entering into. Could you maybe speak a bit more about what that could look like, maybe particularly in the context that you've worked, and how can this take place in kind of the existing political structures? Is that even possible? And yeah, and maybe also in the context of COP as well, how could this even take place?
Great question. I think we have one more, so we'll just take them together. One over there and one over there. Short questions, not too.
Yes, hi. My name's Gwen. I'm a master's student at the Center of African Studies here in Copenhagen. And yeah, I found the talk about how the green message, how that's kind of been misconstrued for the most part. I found that really interesting. And I was kind of wondering if that is kind of seen in the same light in these extractive economies, and how if a green message, if it's message done by like the indigenous peoples there, or the people like the governments in there, is if that's similar, or is that a totally different message and is just misinformation and misunderstanding going all around?
Hi, my name is Ronan. I graduated from KU. I'm a photographer at the moment, I guess. My question is about, for anyone with experience in the Nordics, like what is going on with public discourse here around resource consumption and extractivism? Because at least according to the global footprint calculator, whatever, I mean, Denmark has one of the highest ecological footprints in the world, right? After like Kuwait, UAE, Australia, Canada, USA, Denmark. And then the other Nordic countries are not that far behind, I think, in terms of per capita consumption. So how have we got to this point where it's this sort of public narrative of like, oh, we're such a green leader in transition, and is this just self-delusion, or is it really cynical policymaking, or how do we explain that this is so ubiquitous, this narrative?
Great. I'm afraid we'll have to make that the last question, and we take the rest for later.
Okay, good. So I'll start out this one, and I'll try to tackle the first two. I think the question was around climate change and you know, what does the what can it look like, or what can it be like? But I want to really focus on one of the questions that you said about, can it take place within the existing structures? And I would say no. I would say this is the problem, really, that I think you've hit on the crux of the problem. Within the existing structures, within the existing frameworks, within the existing conceptual, you know, really the extractive capitalist structure that we live in, I don't really see how we shift that inside of these systems. And then you mentioned the UN and Glasgow, which was a complete and total shit show, okay? Like, let me just be very, very clear. And the very last day, on the Saturday, I somehow got inside the main plenary. Like, they didn't check to see. I had an observer badge, and observers weren't let in. You were just, it was like heads of state or you know, like the reps and some journalists. I sat in the back. And I couldn't leave, because if I left to go to use the restroom or something, I knew I wouldn't get back in. And I watched like the representative of Gabon and the representative of small island states nearly breaking down in tears, begging the big, you know, the elite governments to please don't do this. This is a death sentence to us. They literally were saying that. If you pass this, if this goes forward, we are going to be underwater in the next like, you don't understand what is happening. They were begging and pleading, and yet there was then sort of a breakout session, and I watched sort of like all of these huddlings happening, and like, you know, John Kerry talking to the Russian, people, and like all of these different like deals being made. And then they come back, and it was pushed through so fast, where people were like, countries were strong-armed, really, literally, into complying with what was happening in that room and what was being passed. And it really is a death sentence to many people on this planet, and it has been. This is not something new either. So can it take place inside of these structures? Absolutely not. How do we change them? I don't know, but this is the thing, like, people say, what is the solution? Well, there isn't one, right? A problem has a solution, but this isn't a problem. This is a massive dilemma. Dilemmas don't have solutions, they have processes. And so this is why we're here, right? Is to be honest. Like, I'm not here to give you hope. I'm here to, share enough dignity with you to tell you the freaking truth. We are in a massive problem right now, and we have to start confronting what that looks like. And certainly, as like the great researchers have on this up here on this platform have pointed out, is that the way that this is going to a green transition or this green economy is we're being told things that are simply not true, okay? We're being told that it can go in this way and it's all going to be fine, but that is not what's happening. That is not what this looks like, where we need to get off the train, right? That was a lot of metaphors, but thanks for listening to that. And then the last question was sort of dovetailing in there, but I just want to say one last thing, is that these are development programs. The climate change mitigation programs and the carbon accounting and all of that, it's not about climate change, right? This is a continuation of unequal, inequal development programs that we've seen since World War II, right? And very much in that room in Glasgow, I watched the wealthy countries use their power of decades of colonial power over countries in the so-called developing world or the global south. And it was very apparent it wasn't about climate change at all. It was about access to resources. So, thank you.
On that note, we have to round up because we're out of time, and I'm afraid we're very strict on these things here. So I want to thank. We have to take all. I'm sorry, we have to take all the questions at the drink afterwards. So we'll take it there. Please give these speakers a round of applause. Thank you all, guys, for coming. This might have been the last physical seminar we've had here at DIIS. So we hope to see you again next year. You can live stream this and watch share the video if you want afterwards. Please join us for a drink and some discussion in the reception lounge. Thank you so much.